Hey everybody, this is Peter with the Dawn Patrol. I guess it's more of the Dusk Patrol, but John in the UK there. First things first, John. I think you're well known amongst, of course, the serious gaming community as well as the hobby gaming community. I think we have a mutual friend in David Manley over there in the UK.
Yes.
Who speaks highly of you, by the way.
Gosh.
I told him I'd say that. But maybe just a quick introduction of yourself, John, and just, how did you get into this wacky world of wargaming?
Well, I'm an academic. I work at Bath Spa University in the UK, and there I play games largely around cybersecurity. I go to work to play games. I do consultancy in games, and in my spare time, I just play more games. So how did I get involved in this wacky world? Well, by chance, really. When I was a young lad, my brothers introduced me to the first war game, which was by someone called Lionel Tarr, which was the first modern war game, of modern being World War II. They had a self-published book from the library, and they introduced me to this. And it was only years later, decades later, I realized I was the only person in the world who actually had a full copy of the Lionel Tarr rules, because my brothers had copied it out. That was my first introduction to wargaming history. So rolling forward, I published a couple of books on obscure parts of wargaming history, one of them being the Fred Jane Naval Wargame. I published this on the Friday, no publicity. I thought perhaps it would sell 10 copies to the entire world and I would know 7 or 8 of the people who bought it. And by Sunday evening, I'd sold 16 copies and I knew none of the people who bought it. And a few weeks later, someone called Donald Featherstone, who I'd encountered, here and there, rang me up and said, why hadn't I talked to him and published his books? Because clearly I'm rewriting these historical wargaming books. Why hadn't I contacted him? And as soon as Donald Featherstone was on board, all the other authors, the old authors, got in touch with me. And then archive material started arriving at my door and people saying, well, why haven't you asked me? Because I've got a copy of. And it sort of snowballed. So the History of Wargaming project happened by accident. And 130 books later, it's still going.
Approximately when did it officially start? With so you're saying that your publishing of Fred Jane's rules was the first book
Yes.
officially published, and was that
15 years ago, something like that?
Okay. And who was there a publishing company or was it self-published?
No, I self-published it. Now, self-publishing is a complete waste of time unless you can make a market impact. And wargamers are such that if you're the person who's published the Fred Jane rules with explanation of the rules and a sample of play and ship cards and all the things they need, they're going to seek it out. But as soon as Donald Featherstone, Stuart Asquith, Peter Purley, the great names of wargaming were on board, when I got approached by the regular publishers, I thought, why should I go with them? What's the point? So I've carried on as a History of Wargaming self-publisher.
Interesting. Okay, very good. I didn't know that you had continued without a more traditional publisher. That's awesome.
Well, why would I move to a smaller wargaming publisher than I am? So, as in, why would I move to a publisher who sells less wargaming books than I do? Because probably Osprey sell far more than I do. But apart from Osprey, there aren't many in the space.
Right. Yeah. There's like pen and sword books, but that's mostly historic. Yeah, you'd probably have to go to more of the niche history publishers in the UK there, which there are a good amount. But I agree that at that point you're just creating a middleman.
And also, I can publish the obscure. So if I want to publish the Coastal Artillery Wargame 1916, which is about how you get out of model terrain and how you should get people to issue realistic orders, and then you basically use a Fred Jane type naval combat system, Well, I can publish it. It's not a bestseller. It doesn't worry me. But it's a piece of wargaming history. I can just do it and make it happen.
Right.
So yes.
Generally speaking, how long does it take you to kind of to edit any one of these books? Like for example, your Fred Jane's book, how long did it take you to kind of gather up all the information?
I can, once I've assembled the materials, it takes me about 4 weeks of concentrated effort to go from starting to open the Word document to getting the first draft.
So what I will do is I'm going to start showing my screen here just for a second to kind of give folks an idea what's available in your series here. Give me one moment. One of the more recent books that I've.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is a very good book. I just finished it. This was very poignant to me. This one in particular was poignant because this covers what I would describe, at least in American historical framework, more of the Lyceum period, right, where you started to see naval institutes or think tanks beginning to come into fruition, right? You have the formation of the USNI. You have, I think, the formation of our RUSI. Do you call it RUSI or is it RUSI? How do you RUSI?
I call it RUSI, but you can call it either.
Okay. Which oddly enough, I didn't know a large amount about. I don't know how, because I've read a lot of these books, so I just didn't really run into it too much. If we were to frame ourselves first with this book, which I think very squarely sits at the beginning of more traditional naval wargaming rules. There probably were people who always would maybe take charts out and talk over courses of action prior to this, but this is probably the first. This is the first indication of professional naval, warriors and captains and leaders taking the chance to show others what they were working on. Right. I have a suspicion that. Since ever since probably the American Civil War was probably the largest continued naval conflict of that century, other than, of course, the Napoleonic Wars, which we separate, of course, the Age of Sail.
Yes.
So just bring us up to speed a little bit, pun intended, I guess.
So the book came from because I got really irritated by an academic who was talking about Fred Jane as the inventor of the naval war game. And this really irritated me. So what I was published was the key war games which led up to Fred Jane and his 1898 naval war game. And that rather it shows it was in a sequence of development. So Fred Jane was brilliant, but absolutely completely eccentric. I mean, he was as mad as a March hare. I mean, he stood for Parliament, he beat someone up, he was involved in one of the first road traffic accidents. I mean, he was eccentric, all right, but he was also inspired. But his game came out of these war games before it. So Lieutenant Castle's game was interesting. So this game didn't actually have a combat system. And what happened was that people played the game and they maneuvered the ships, and he said, do you realize our admirals don't actually know the turning circles of our warships? That data is not readily available. So what would happen in actual war is an admiral turning the fleet would turn very gently because he wouldn't be sure of the turning circles of all the squadron behind him. So there was an early example of a war game generating a point which then changes naval practice. So they then obviously generated the turning circles, the maximum turning circles, minimum turning circles for all the warships. So an admiral would have that information just to hand when it came to war. And the way the game worked was you spend all your time maneuvering and then you would argue about who had the advantage when it came to combat. So it was a war game getting people to talk about war fighting. So the Fred Jane game, when it came along, it was part of a sequence, and it was exceptional. It was treated seriously. I mean, there was no question about it. You see pictures or sketches of it being played out in the George, which is the pub, and there's captains from different navies. They're playing it, and it's war. It's not a game. It's serious. And the Coastal Artillery War Game was sort of a development. It was American, and it was really to try and make, the coastal batteries training a little bit more interesting by giving them a short game to play. Anyway, so that's the story of that book.
What I found interesting in reading this one in particular was, and I think I've read this elsewhere before, that there was a preponderance of a desire to ram in this time period. Right?
Yes.
I found that to be. I've heard that before, but this is the first time I've seen good conversational or debate or dialogue on the ramifications, pun intended, of the use of that tactic.
Yes.
Let me let you talk about that.
So the game in the duel had the ram versus the gun, and they had an account of the Russia session where it presented, and the people there were vitriolic about the game and its inadequacies, etc. They were about all the war games. And at the end, the Admiral says, who's chairing the session, "This is really great, isn't it? Because what are we doing? We're all talking about war fighting and the different options, and the game's inspired us." And then it was a rousing round of applause, and everyone thought it was a jolly good show. So to me, Russia of the 19th century was at the epitome of military practice, because ideas were presented, dissected, regardless of rank. And at the end, people could say, well, we disagree, but that was a really great, useful discussion. And that's really how it should work. Let's test these ideas to destruction. Let's kick the ideas around and take out the very best. We don't analyze games or military practice like they did then. Gosh, no.
Right, and we don't argue about it at all, ever, at conventions or otherwise, right?
Well, not enough, no.
Place a few grognards in the same room, and we'll talk about it. But what was interesting, it does taper into the effectiveness of the torpedo attack as well, which I thought was it was just interesting to start just seeing individuals talking to it and about it, and talking about they're getting pretty detailed as far as the angle of attack, knowing the distances, and they didn't get too deeply into necessarily the effectiveness of the torpedoes themselves, which were pretty crude at that point, at least until a gyroscope. So tell me a little bit early, frame in Chamberlain's naval blockade, which I thought that game was a little bit more specific, right? It was a little odd, I guess is the way I would describe it, and how it kind of it was almost a build your own ship too, right? Where it allowed you to put a gun on a broadside, two guns on a broadside, and one of a chaser, or a bow chaser, which was interesting. I thought that was kind of a weird mechanic, right? And I'm kind of, it's like an early what if. It's an early form of Ultimate Admiral or some other
it was
rule the waves.
That game was designed for junior ranks.
Okay.
They would play the game either on the ship or a shore station, and it was trying to pull them away from the day-to-day task of just making the ship sail, from managing the men, to get and think about war fighting and gunnery. And that's the really interesting aspect. These games were saying, okay, we accept you know how to sail the ship, but can you sail the ship into combat? Can you get the decisive advantage? Can you win? And that's actually the tale of, the 20th century and 21st century, is pulling the warriors in our armed forces away from just making the tank go to building a bridge to how can you use these when you're at war?
Yeah, I think that was exemplified more in some of these early games. As far as I think it was even mentioned. I'm hoping it was this book. Um, with the portability of it too, right? And they had mentioned the portability as a positive aspect of the games, physically being able to be in the boardroom or the wardroom, being able to be played while on station, right? Which was kind of interesting, which is interesting to see. And I think the chairman during one of the arguments, I can't remember for which one, stated that they should have a ready-made board available for students to be able to walk up to and play. I thought that was brilliant.
Yes.
And I think that's something potentially that even modern professional military or PME
yes.
locations might want to take to heart is kind of making, again, I think that's what a lot of the warfighting clubs, UK Fight Club, USA Fight Club, and each branch's individual warfighting clubs, right? They've transposed that into the virtual, which I do want to have a conversation with you towards the end, because I know you recently wrote an article about how wargaming is changing, and I do want to talk about that at the end,
yes.
maybe just to.
You've hit on one of the innovations of Admiral Fisher prior to World War I was he set up the wargaming room, which was full of ship models, full of models, harbours and sea spaces, and officers were allowed to go there at any time of the day or the night to fight out tactics, to explore historical problems, sometimes wargame rules, sometimes just using it as visualization aids. The wargaming room, can you imagine that? It's just there. Everything is there. You can just walk in any time of the day or night. If you've got a problem, you want to think about something, the tools are there. Just do it.
Right, and you do see that emphasis of problem interaction, and then even potentially change, especially as you get into the interwar period, which we'll talk about a little bit. So one thing I noticed, and this very well could be caused by, of course, the Great War that happens, right? Is we don't necessarily hear directly what the Royal Navy is potentially using. We do see evidence in this second book where you focus more on the later revised edition of Jane's, and I think I have a copy of the 1905. Well, 1906.
I'm going to fill in the gap. I'm editing a book at the moment, which is about. It's probably going to be 2 volumes. It's absolutely ramjam full of detailed accounts of Royal Navy war games prior to World War One, including a little bit about the German naval war games, and a little bit about the Russian naval war games. So that's hopefully is going to fill in the gap.
Perfect.
Yeah. And it's taken someone several years hard work to pull that out of our archives. It's all there. It's
right. What I suspected, which might not be the truth, was that, as conflict was becoming clear, it became more service. They might even have made it clearance based or something more so at that point. What I didn't know necessarily was, did Fred Jane's game come out and then all of these navies kind of went into their corners and did their own thing and kind of kept it from each other at that point. There is a little bit of competition here. And even at that time, right, the British and the Japanese were taking part in naval conflict early in World War One, which there's a very, very good Dawning of the Sun, I think that's the name of it, but there's a great war game about that, by the way. Board game by John Gorkowski. I just spoke to him recently. The only reason I remember that. So again, there's interesting conflicts of interest, and then there's an interesting sway in that once, of course, the Japanese end up needing to coordinate with the Russians in the Pacific against the Germans. So it's such an interesting period. For me, this is the golden period of naval wargaming and just naval history. There's so much going on as far as by the time anybody wrote one of these war games and the tables for them. The tables were probably not useful by the time, maybe even by the time it got published, just because so many things were new, right? And especially as you kind of move into the Russo-Japanese War, where even the projectile types were changing, and one emphasis, I think it was in this book, was that Fred Jane, I think, emphasized his books, especially his annexes, his fighting ship books, more for silhouette recognition, like the basic recognition. What I loved about what he was doing is he had a very practical approach to why he was documenting all of this, right? Whether purposefully for conflict or not, we can argue, but yeah, so it's incredibly good to hear that you may fill the blanks in there, because it is missing a little bit. So let's talk about form and function a little bit as we move into Fred Jane's. It's quite a novel concept or approach with the as you can see behind me, there's the, let me move out of the way, there's the Jane's paddle board. I call this looks like a Catholic torture device of some point. It's extremely novel, ahead of its time. I think one of the only naval war games I'm aware of that kind of still held on to that silhouette aspect is like Perfidious Albion. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to play that.
Yes.
Great system. So it was quite, even though it was like one of the first, we'll call it the first major or refined or even commercially offered rule sets, it was quite detailed in even though it was open formed in some of the adjudication, right? As far as judging the results, the actual accuracy was incredible. I'll stop talking.
So it's the paddle board where you have a pin underneath. You don't know exactly where the pin is. You whack it up and down to represent the shots, and the silhouette, different sizes depending on the range you're firing at. The advantage of that system is you hold it up to the light, and when you've had practice, you can arbitrate the combat very, very quickly. You look it up, you say, oh, right, I know what's been hit. This is the effect. And in the 1898 rules, he had more guidance about the effect of the gunnery. And as time went on, it became more free Kriegspiel, perhaps because they just had more experience of actually hitting ships with large shells. So you didn't need someone to tell you what the chance of this happening. You can say, oh, that's going to penetrate the turret. And it's interesting that the Jane's Fighting Ships was the first playing aid for a war game, because the aim of that was actually to assist you playing the war game. The gunnery system worked. The games were popular, they were interesting, and as you can see from that picture, they were there.
So kind of speaking of the popularity aspect, you don't necessarily see the naval war games going into the parlors of New York City, if you will, until Fletcher Pratt, right?
Yes.
And that, I believe, the first version was in 28. They're very different systems, and I don't know if either or both may have been slightly influenced by H.G. Wells' land-based war game as well, where things were a little bit more literal, right? Where you were more by the eye, trying to figure things out, distances and or accuracies. So it was interesting. It's extremely interesting to see some of these early war games and how they were trying to add in the human factor in some way.
Yes.
What was interesting in Fred Jane's is I think even he had mentioned that in his talk at Russi in 1898 or 1897, I think it was before it was published. Right? was that you even started to emphasize the morale, right? Because as you got excited, like
Yes.
there's a literal physical aspect, and that's gone. That I think over time a lot of that has gone away. You could label some of that as eccentric or kind of gimmicky, but they were gimmicky with purpose, which was
Yes.
extremely interesting to me. Is that
Yeah.
it wasn't necessarily just experimentation from a rules perspective. It was an attempt at naval Kriegspiel, which
Yes. So the Fletcher Pratt naval war game was probably one of the most successful naval war games of all time. I mean, it's still in print, it's still played, it's regularly played in Britain because it's fun. It also models aspects other big gun naval games don't include, such as ship recognition. So in the Fletcher Pratt game, when your models are on the floor, if you don't recognize which are the enemy battleships and which are heavy cruisers, well, you've got a problem. If you're not quite sure what your own size ships look like, when the ships start to get intermingled, it matters. Having a good plan matters because the physicality of you being spread out, the admirals are spread out on the floor commanding their ships, means if you haven't got a plan before the battle, you haven't got one during the battle. Morale comes into it. So there's nothing like seeing destroyers coming in, and as they get wrecked, seeing what the other destroyers do. And I've seen people flee. I saw a well-known naval historian fleeing with his destroyers because of failure of morale, and you don't really see that in other naval war games.
Mm-hmm.
It models big gun naval warfare pretty well. In fact, Commander Bothwell, who was the last of the Fletcher Pratt players, I interviewed him before he passed away, said, it modeled naval warfare very well for that period. It was deterministic in so much as when you hit, it always does the same amount of damage depending on the caliber of the gun and if it penetrates the armor. So it doesn't have the random element, but if your aim of playing the game is to say, if we put these ships against each other and they're using these tactics, this is going to be the average outcome. The Fletcher Pratt game actually does it better than something involving a Monte Carlo simulation, which you don't know after you played the encounter once. Was it just chance the reason one side won? Or was it because of better tactics? I must also say, equality. The Fletcher Pratt Naval War Game was the first one which women took part in regularly. So there were regularly teams of seamstresses and people, I can't remember what they call, people who measure curtains. And apparently they were a formidable team because they were very good at estimating things in inches.
Right.
In fact, they have one of the American admirals who was the commander of the South Pacific fleet was there. Fletcher Pratt was away on board an aircraft carrier as a war reporter, and his wife was in charge of the game. And you talk about, a couple of hundred people. Anyway, the admiral's team were being absolutely walloped because they were up against a team of women who could estimate accurately. But fortunately, there was a Royal Navy destroyer. He wasn't a captain, but anyway, he was in charge of torpedoes, and he took 5 of the destroyers. He knew how to launch a torpedo attack, and he won the day. So it was all right. So the American admiral won the game. So that was all right then. Yeah. And the games, they were also social experiences. It was, people went there on dates. Can you imagine that, saying, hey, would you like to come play my naval war game? And I thought these stories...
It doesn't go over as well now.
Yeah, I thought these stories were anecdotal from Donald Featherstone when I heard them. But I actually had a letter from someone who sent me some of the stuff from the original Fletcher Pratt game, whose parents got married and they met in the New York ballroom playing this game. So it wasn't anecdotal. It was somewhere, men and women could meet during wartime, have some fun, have a few drinks, and play a game.
Was there a significant difference in how the British were approaching wargaming in the interwar period versus how the Americans were?
Well, I've got a PhD student who's modelling the Royal Navy war games against the American naval war games at the moment, actually using computer modelling. Now, the United States definitely, had the edge in naval wargaming because they were playing at the Naval War College I mean, continually. So as the students were coming through, they were teaching them, they're playing a game. They were talking about historical battles, they were demonstrating it, playing a game. And it was serious stuff. Now, it's quite funny. So after the war, Admiral Nimitz, who commanded the US Pacific Fleet in World War II, said, nothing happened in the Pacific War which wasn't played out in the war game except for kamikazes. Now, by sheer chance, his actual speech is stored in the archives, and so he didn't quite mean what it seemed like he meant, because there were huge differences between the Naval War College games and the actual war. And so I did a presentation on this, and it was quite sunny, the mental flip-flop which then happened by the professional gamers. So the US Naval War College expected it to be a big gun action during daytime. That was how the Pacific War would be decided. Now, of course, it couldn't, because the Americans lost their battleships. And they expected gunner reactions by day. And of course, in the Pacific War, most gunner reactions were at night. And they expected centralized command, where in the actual Pacific War, it's decentralized command. Because if your destroyers are 40 miles away fighting an action, your battleship guarding your aircraft carrier, you can't possibly have. You've got a decentralized command. And of course, the role of aircraft. And there are a number of differences. But in some ways, it didn't matter. Because when it actually came to war is always different from the war games. But one of the interesting things is that I think, and it's been quite well established, that the American commanders had a mental agility to adapt to the surprises and change the conditions in the actual Pacific War than the Japanese. So even when they got surprised by the long lance torpedoes or the impact of aircraft or some of the Japanese tactics, the US commanders, they were used to the rules changing in the war games, so they adapted quickly. And it also helped that many of the commanders knew each other. How did they know each other? Because they all played at the Naval War College in these war games. And that must have helped, mustn't it? The fact you knew some of the people around you and on the different ships. So the war games were absolutely invaluable and were a key component to the US naval victory in the Pacific. Now, of course, jumping across to Britain, we have the WATU unit, Western Protectorate Tactical Unit, and their war games were obviously key in helping to develop anti-U-boat tactics and training people.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So yeah, with the REN activity during that period, that's when you start to see a little bit more of a shift to not necessarily professional aspect, but more very specific problems, right? And
yes.
And those problems being kind of insulated and if not held to secrecy more, right? And
yes.
so that's ultimately when you start to see professional wargaming kind of basically come onto itself, right? Where there was service oriented, but now there's potentially, secret rerunning of certain scenarios that are not in the open and not publicly available, right? So I've always found that to be fascinating. Just to rewind just a tiny bit here.
Yes.
What do you see in each of these? These are basically 4 stages of early naval wargaming, right? I mean, what do you see as the main problem they were trying to solve, or problems? What, like in these very early ones? I'll put one thing out and then I'll give you the floor. They definitely attended to the rate of fire pretty well, I thought, in the conversation that the rules invoked, right, with the quick fires, which maybe the Russians didn't take to heart as well as they could have at Tsushima. But any other aspects of what were they most concerned? What were they trying to solve or question in this early period?
They were trying to pull naval officers away from the mere problems of sailing the ship and making a ship function, from the issues of commanding men, and I'm not undervaluing these things, to going from that to war fighting. And they were all trying to develop the mental agility of the officers to assess problems, tactical problems, and get an advantage. Because the US Navy, the US Naval War College, was putting down games regularly, and they weren't hesitating to stop the game when the learning point had been made, or if one side had done something foolish, they'd stop the game, say, stop, you've done something wrong, let's rewind, what you should have done is this, and then carry on with the game. That's what they were trying to do.
And there was a significant gap in time, almost a generational gap, in a significant a surface battle for the Royal Navy in particular, right? It had been potentially, I mean, there was obviously some colonial scraps, if you will, throughout, but there hadn't really been the decisive battle that May and others had called for or were predicting, right? There weren't.
No.
So you had a lot of officers that didn't have combat experience at that point.
No,
right?
they didn't.
At least
No.
junior, right? So then there's also, I think we spoke to it before, the question of the efficacy of the torpedo and how it would play into the next larger surface conflict. They don't get too deep into that. What's the interesting parallel between here and the interwar period is you do see in the interwar period the question of air power, right? But not necessarily the conclusion of the dominance, right? Am I right or wrong in that?
Yes. Now, it's interesting enough that the Fletcher Pratt game, a civilian game, had many insights about naval warfare, which proved accurate during the Pacific War. Of course, they didn't necessarily know that at the time, and it might have been not just the game, but when you had bright people like Fletcher Pratt, Sprague de Camp, Isaac Asimov, scientists, people who after the war, went on to do big things. If you put a lot of bright people together and play a game, it's probably inevitable they can come up with insights. And they'd figured out that the only way to stop aircraft was aircraft. So they were ahead of the curve.
So what's interesting is, as again, we'll call Fred Janes the kind of like the baseline of more modern wargaming, the completeness of it, the accuracy of penetration and velocity and rate of fire and so forth. So you start to see that simulation aspect kind of breathing in. What did World War I? How did the Great War affect naval wargaming? Because
well, the Royal Navy was a learning organization. So after Jutland, which is a battle the Royal Navy won because they had maintained their strategic superiority over the Germans, and the Germans never came out again. They analysed what had happened very quickly, and they'd realised, the mistakes which were made and how the fires had happened, and they changed the practice. So I like to think, though I think we'll know more, when the book gets published about, the Royal Navy War Games before, that the Royal Navy had become a learning organisation. So had the capacity, even in wartime, to say, no, it worked wrong, it went wrong. People were trying the rate of fire, and to accelerate the rate of fire, what had they done? They left open the blast doors, which went to stop the flash getting to the magazine. They'd stripped some of the linings, hadn't they, to accelerate the speed they could get the shells through the system to fire. And they'd learnt this, and this is a learning organisation. So I like to think that, but I think I'd have to defer to other naval historians who've studied it more than I have.
How would you explain the somewhat lack of consideration of submersible warfare, U-boats in some of these interwar period war games? It obviously, with the Hochflotte, the High Fleet of the German Imperial Navy, changing its strategies towards the latter years of World War I, it became evident and rather significant. but what I'm finding, at least in kind of reading over some of these interwar rule sets, they don't put a great deal of emphasis on undersea warfare or countering it. I think
Yes.
more so in countering it. Go ahead.
We know Donitz, as part of Nazi Germany before World War II, was playing war games using U-boats against a mock Royal Navy and mock merchant ships in the Atlantic. And that's how he knew, for example, when the U-boat war happened, he didn't have enough forces to win. He knew that before the first U-boat sailed. But I think that the Royal Navy did have some appreciation. And we know this because the Western Approaches Tactical Unit got set up awfully quickly, and they were playing a war game almost as soon as the Wrens moved in, and they were using the Royal Navy rules from that period. So they had.
And they were. See, that was one question I had, was whether or not which system had taken root, and did the Watu and Wrens, did they augment it and then it became available?
Yes.
Or yeah.
So I will publish a book, because I have actually now got a copy of the Watu rules. Or one
wow. Yes. Okay.
And it seems like they used the Royal Navy war game of the period and sort of bolted on the Watu tables on top. So the Watu war game was actually 3 naval war games. It was a tactical war game, which is to train people whose English is not necessarily their first language in tactical procedures and messaging. So you put the commanders in a room, isolate from each other. They have to communicate using message pads, and a situation is actually out before them, and they can look through a little slot to look down at what's happening on the floor. So that's a training game. The operation analysis game is played in slow time without them there, and that's to explore. So if the Germans do this, what could we do? And it's like a manual computer. So you'd say, right, this happens. Where could the U-boat be? It could be in one of these 16 different locations. What are the tactics to maximize the number of locations we can hit with depth charges? So that's an operation analysis game. And the third part of the Watu story is they played a strategic war game to explore strategic options in the Battle of the Atlantic. So the carrier support groups, was it worth pulling escorts out of the convoys and having a separate group? Could it intervene? So the actual battle was happening on the maps, but they had a separate map and had a hypothetical carrier support group floating around, and seeing whether or not, with the actual situation, could it get there in time? And then they realized it could, so they formed carrier support groups. And there was the fourth war game, which was maybe the most important use of it, which was for D-Day. The D-Day was the most complex naval action of all time. And an awful lot of ship commanders don't necessarily speak good English. What do? You assemble them together and you plot out the moves and the options and the actions on a huge great floor. And it's using the game as a visualization tool for getting across the message to them. So if the U-boats happen here, what do? Where is your position in the convoy? If we go to starboard, you do start to see how it would happen. A visualization tool using the ships and the Wrens, with 1,000 or tens of thousands of ships which took part in D-Day, and maybe the fact that the Watu team helped D-Day actually happen, or the naval part of D-Day actually happen smoothly, because of the training they offered the commanders. I've taken a touchline from my new book, haven't I?
Yeah, that was my whole goal here, right? Is to convince you that there are more books to be written. There are two topics. I'll end with these. I might be able to offline some answers to this, but you mentioned strategic rules and the operational warfare. And what's interesting is if you even look at some of the early the rules, especially even the maneuvering only one, the first one, your first book there.
Yes.
It does emphasize the strategic aspects of it. It does emphasize having a good understood plan at the top commander level, but also at the squadron and division level. So one of my subsequent questions, and we can kind of maybe end with this. how did wargaming throughout this period, up through the interwar period, improve communications? Did it have any direct effect on the development of signal guides or even wireless guides of the time, by any chance?
Well, we know in the United States War College, they tried things, even unrealistic things in their war games, because they were experimenting, like ship-to-ship refueling, for example, amphibious operations, ship-to-shore communications. They were trying out all these different things in their games. So it would be hard to know, without extensive research, good PhD on this, to know, but it gave the opportunity to have sport with ideas. And if you're getting decision makers to have sport with ideas, to me as an academic, that seems an inherently good thing to do with some of their time.
We'll end here, but the amazing thing about this whole thing is even recent modern games that are trying to predict near future, it's just, for me, it's just extremely interesting to see that almost the same questions are being asked, just framed usually on different technology, right, or predicted technology.
Yes.
And what's also interesting in an analogy is that the more wargaming happens, you see relatively good evidence that there is more preparation, which I hope anybody in our ministries or congresses are listening to this at some point and realize the worth of wargaming. And it's only recently that I've personally kind of really embraced it as not only a hobby, but a necessary act of putting yourself in a situation where there are unknowns, right? And you're fighting a thinking enemy, right? And
yes,
I do want to applaud you on the entire series. I have several of the land-based rule sets as well. You're hurting my wallet left and right in a good way. No, they're all very well priced. But the naval series in particular, I think, is a godsend here, and I appreciate you having gone through the effort, really, the personal effort, to, I'm assuming, produce books that you wanted to read and have the research of, which is usually the best reason to work on anything, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wish you the best. Do you want to mention before we sign off? Do you want to mention any other upcoming publications?
Well, the next couple of books I'm going to come out, one is on Matrix games, which is a narrative way of gaming, made a massive impact in professional wargaming. The second, which overlaps what we talked about, is wargaming in World War II. And that book is talking about how the Germans wargamed in World War II, what some of the guidelines, some of the procedures, 3 examples of German tactical exercises, the umpiring rules which the British and the Americans used, and a short carrier war game from the Royal Navy. So rather than just saying, yeah, both sides used war games, what the History of Wargaming Project does is try to say, well, here's some actual examples for you to look at and make your own judgments about them. And so I'm hoping the book will be of use, that people will actually be able to create for themselves, hobby gamers, professional gamers, a few of those war games themselves on their tables and saying, okay, these were the rules used at the time. This is how they thought. And to me, that's just absolutely fascinating.
Right. Yeah. To myself as well. Just kind of seeing that individuals saw the worth of it, and we're doing something about it. Really, it's kind of energizing just to kind of see people working out things, right? Regardless of topic.
My final thought about wargaming is really a quote from the Duke of Wellington, who said, all of war, in fact, all of life, is trying to find out what's the other side of the hill from where you are now. And wargaming allows you to explore what could be the other side of the hill. And the key thing it does, it gives you the mental agility to adjust to different scenarios, different situations, different problems, and make a decision faster. And in modern warfare, he who makes the decision faster often wins.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll wrap it up with that wonderful quote. Thank you very much, John, for taking part in this.
Pleasure.
I'm hoping maybe after the release of 2 or 3 of those books you mentioned, we'll get together and at least discuss what they cover, just to a little degree.
Yeah, happy to.
Know what's going on. But thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.